Life is a way of falling into routines, even when you think you've got it all figured out. For me, it wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I had Jessica, my wife of 15 years, and we'd built a decent life together. We didn't have kids, though we'd thought about it a few times early on. In a way, our routines became our kids, the house, the jobs, the social circles. She worked in sales and spent a lot of time networking, which meant she was out quite a bit, even after hours. It was part of her job, so I didn't think much of it. My own job? Well, I was an operations manager for a local manufacturing company. The work was structured and predictable, which suited me just fine. I got along with my colleagues, and we'd even have the occasional beer after a long shift, but I kept it simple. Jessica was the social one, and I let her have the spotlight there. As long as I knew she'd be coming home to me, I was content. Our neighborhood was a tight-knit one, the kind where people look out for each other. We all gathered a few times a year, had the classic barbecues in the summer, a Christmas party, and Halloween. That night was one of those traditions, and like every year, Dan and his wife invited everyone over for a Halloween bash. Dan was a straightforward guy, a family man, and he'd go all out with decorations every year for his daughter's sake. The whole house would be transformed with cobwebs, pumpkins, and skeletons. And every year, Jessica looked forward to it, planning her costume weeks in advance, just like clockwork. This year, she dressed as a pirate, a costume she'd worn a few times before. She looked fantastic, of course, and I could see the pride in her eyes when she saw how people noticed. I wanted something simpler, just a mask and a black cloak. Jessica teased me about it, saying I was no fun, but it was all in good humor. We'd been to this party enough times for her to know I preferred to just hang back and watch. That evening, the whole neighborhood showed up in full costume. The place was packed. Kids ran through the hallways in their costumes, laughing and shouting. It was a bit of chaos, but that was part of the fun. I stuck to the back, chatting with a couple of neighbors and nursing a beer, watching as Jessica and our friends mingled and laughed. I could see her and Tom, my best friend since college, over by the drinks, chatting like they always did. Tom was a regular fixture in our lives, and he and Jessica got along easily, which I'd always appreciated. The three of us had shared so many memories over the years that I never questioned it. But that night, something felt different. Maybe it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, but as I watched her with Tom, there was something about the way they leaned in close, the way they laughed a bit too easily. Jessica's eyes sparkled, her hand lightly brushing his arm as she laughed. And Tom, well, I noticed his hand lingered on her shoulder a second longer than necessary. I didn't react, not outwardly. I told myself it was just the drinks, the costumes, the carefree vibe of the party. Still, the feeling lingered. They both eventually drifted back into the crowd, and the night continued without incident. But as we headed home, Jessica was quieter than usual. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying she was just tired. It wasn't much, just a simple exchange, but something about her tone felt off. I let it go, not wanting to ruin the night. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling. Jessica went about her routine as usual, but there was a subtle shift. She seemed more guarded, her phone always close by. She was still out late for work sometimes, but now she was more vague about where she was going, giving brief explanations or none at all. And the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. One night, about a week after the Halloween party, I was at home, going through some paperwork, when there was a knock at the door. It was Dan, our neighbor. He was holding a serious expression, looking almost hesitant to be there. "Hey, got a minute?" he asked, his voice low. "Sure, come on in," I replied, setting down my papers. I could tell by his tone that this wasn't just a casual visit. We went into the kitchen, and I poured him a coffee, waiting for him to speak. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as if he wasn't sure where to begin. "Look, I didn't know if I should bring this up," he started, glancing down at his cup. "But there's something you need to see. It's about Jessica." The room felt suddenly smaller. My stomach tightened, and I felt that same uneasy feeling I'd had at the party. "What do you mean, Dan?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He cleared his throat, glancing away before meeting my eyes. It happened at the Halloween party. My daughter's room. I had a camera set up, just for security, to keep an eye on things while everyone was here. And, something came up on the footage, something I think you should see. I couldn't speak for a moment, my mind racing through 1,000 scenarios, none of them good. "All right," I said slowly. "Show me." Dan took out his phone and played the footage, his hand steady as he held it up for me to see. The screen showed a hallway, dimly lit, leading to his daughter's room. And there, clear as day, was Jessica, slipping into the room with Tom. They were laughing quietly, glancing around like they didn't want to be seen. My jaw clenched as I watched Tom pull her close, his hand on her waist. And then they kissed. It was quick, but it was enough. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening, a cold rage settling in. "Dan, are you sure this was that night?" I managed to ask, though my voice was strained. He nodded, his face full of sympathy. "Yeah, I am sure. Mom, I didn't want to believe it either. But when I saw it, well, I knew you had to know." I thanked him quietly, though I barely heard my own voice. Dan left shortly after, leaving me alone with the weight of what I'd just seen. The silence of the house felt oppressive, and I found myself sitting in the kitchen, staring at nothing, my mind racing. Everything I thought I knew about Jessica, about Tom, was shattered. All those moments at the party, the casual touches, the laughter, it was all there, right in front of me, and I'd missed it. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to see it. But now, there was no denying it. I wasn't some naive fool, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. No, if they wanted to betray me, they were going to feel the consequences. Over the next few days, I kept to myself, replaying the scenes in my mind, thinking back to all the little moments that suddenly had new meaning. I watched Jessica closely, noting every phone call she took in private, every excuse she made for being out late. I even checked her laptop when she was out, finding hints of late-night messages, plans for secret meetups. It was clear she was being careful, but not careful enough. I also knew Tom had his own secrets, specifically a history with fraud at his company. It was something I'd overlooked, a minor slip he'd told me about in confidence, trusting me to keep it between us. But now, that trust was gone. I was going to use every bit of information I had to make sure he paid for what he'd done. It wasn't going to be a quick confrontation or a shouting match. No, this was going to be a slow, deliberate reckoning. For the next few days, I was in a haze, moving through the motions of daily life, but always with that sharp edge of awareness gnawing at me. Every time I looked at Jessica, every time she laughed or made a casual comment about her day, I saw it through new eyes. This was a woman I'd trusted for 15 years, and now I felt like I was seeing a stranger. Still, I wasn't about to tip my hand. Letting her know that I knew, that was exactly what she would expect from someone caught off guard by betrayal. She probably assumed I'd be too rattled, too hurt to think clearly if I ever found out. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I buried every ounce of anger, every stab of humiliation, deep inside. I needed a clear mind if I was going to do this right. My first step was to continue gathering evidence. What I'd seen in Dan's footage was proof, yes, but if I was going to expose this betrayal fully, especially in front of her family and friends, I needed more. I had to paint a complete picture of her deceit, one that would leave no room for doubt or excuses. The next evening, when Jessica was out for another late meeting, I started with her phone. She had left it charging in the kitchen, and while she'd been cautious about clearing out her messages lately, she hadn't realized I'd already noticed her habit of deleting entire conversation threads. There were no texts from Tom, nothing that directly implicated her, but I knew that with someone as calculated as Jessica, the absence of evidence was evidence itself. So I kept digging. The phone's history was bare. Conversations deleted, calls wiped clean. But I was ready for that. I had recently learned about an online backup app, one that could recover deleted texts from cloud storage. All it took was some careful maneuvering to get it set up, syncing the phone with my laptop without her knowledge. The process was slow, but I was patient. Once I had it running, it would record every new message and call automatically. In the meantime, I dug deeper into her laptop. Jessica was always on it for work, but I knew her passwords, and I was able to access her email. There was nothing immediately incriminating, but her sent messages held clues, phrases that hinted at meetups, dinners, and nights that she claimed were just work events. I cross-referenced her calendar, noting every instance she had marked as work, dinner with colleagues, or networking. I began to build a timeline, each event a possible date with Tom. But that wasn't enough. If this affair had been going on for a while, there had to be more. My instincts told me that this wasn't some recent fling, and I was determined to find out how long it had been happening. I checked her browser history, knowing she often accessed her personal email there. And sure enough, there was a second account, a private email she'd logged into a handful of times. My pulse quickened as I realized she hadn't logged out of it. The emails in that account confirmed my suspicions. They weren't explicit, but the messages between her and Tom were filled with vague references, inside jokes, and phrases that clearly had a deeper meaning. There were mentions of next time and last week, indicating this wasn't some one-time lapse in judgment. They'd met up multiple times, each one masked as something innocent. She'd carefully crafted her lies, weaving a narrative of work commitments and long nights to keep me in the dark. As the days went on, Jessica's behavior became increasingly suspicious. She was taking calls in other rooms, laughing quietly at her texts, and more than once, she left the room abruptly when I entered, as if my presence was an intrusion. I watched her closely, noting each small tell that revealed her guilt. Her eyes darting away when I asked about her day, the way she gripped her phone tighter whenever it buzzed, her tense silences. It was clear she was on edge, almost as if she sensed my growing awareness. But still, she didn't suspect a thing. At this point, I realized it was time to take things up a notch. I began planning my next move, documenting her whereabouts without her knowing. I placed a small, discreet GPS tracker under the passenger seat of her car. It was easy enough to set up, and from there I could monitor her trips, watch every place she visited, every suspicious detour. She often used her car for meetings, so I'd know if her routes aligned with the time she was supposed to be working. It didn't take long for the tracker to yield results. A few nights later, while I sat at home pretending to be buried in paperwork, the GPS pinged. Jessica's car was parked at a hotel on the other side of town. She told me she was meeting with a client for dinner, but here she was checked in at a hotel with Tom. The notification gave me the address and even an approximate length of her stay. My stomach twisted, but I stayed calm, jotting down the information for later. With each piece of evidence, my plan took shape. I wasn't only going to confront Jessica, I was going to dismantle every piece of her story in front of the people who mattered most to her. And as for Tom, he had his own reckoning coming. You see, Tom had always been just a little too arrogant, a little too careless. I'd known for a while that he was skimming from his company, manipulating budgets and inflating expenses. He'd bragged about it more than once, laughing it off as if it was just some harmless perk. I kept quiet then, not wanting to get involved, but now I saw it for what it was: leverage. I began drafting an anonymous letter, one that outlined every shady deal Tom had pulled at work. I detailed the budget manipulations, the fraudulent expense reports, the quiet dinners that should never have been billed to the company. I made sure to include dates and figures, information only someone close to him would know, making it impossible to dismiss. The company was large, well-organized, and strict on policy. They wouldn't hesitate to investigate. I mailed the letter to his company's HR department, making sure to address it directly to his supervisors. It was only a matter of time before his little side hustle caught up with him, and he'd find himself under scrutiny. He'd never know it was me, and by the time he figured it out, he'd be too busy trying to save his career to worry about me. Meanwhile, I continued collecting every scrap of evidence against Jessica. I was patient, documenting every new text, every meeting, every detail. I had already marked her birthday on the calendar. It was in just a few weeks, and I planned to use the family gathering to reveal everything. Jessica's parents, her siblings, and close friends would be there, along with our shared circle of friends, including Tom. I couldn't think of a more fitting time to expose them both. But in the meantime, I acted like the devoted husband. I still kissed her goodbye in the mornings, still helped her with her work events, still played my role as if nothing had changed. She had no idea of the storm that was brewing. Every morning, I watched her leave, dressed impeccably for work, every inch of her facade polished and perfect. And every night, I gathered more evidence, building a wall around her lies, piece by piece. As the date of her birthday approached, the weight of it all began to feel almost satisfying. There was something empowering about it, knowing that I had all the cards, that I was the one in control. Jessica thought she was safe, that her secrets were buried, but I was 2 steps ahead of her at every turn. As the weeks passed, I continued to watch Jessica with a careful eye. I'd become something of a stranger in my own home, observing her, noting every subtle shift in her behavior. The way she glanced at her phone a little too eagerly, the way her voice softened when she took certain calls, her hurried excuses as she rushed out the door. All of it fed the growing web of betrayal she'd woven around herself. I'd always been attentive, but now I was seeing her with a clarity I hadn't known before. Every time she left, I'd glance at the tracker, and it was almost predictable. She'd tell me she was going to a late dinner with colleagues or a client meeting, and without fail, her car would end up parked at a familiar hotel or tucked away in a neighborhood I knew wasn't connected to her work. One night, she didn't even bother with an excuse. Jessica simply kissed me on the cheek, said she was heading out, and was gone. I watched her drive away, and moments later, my phone buzzed with the tracker's location. Another hotel, a different one this time, but close enough to home that she could make it back in an hour if she wanted. It was late, but I decided to drive by the hotel, parking a few blocks away to avoid being seen. I didn't expect to catch them together, but there was a twisted satisfaction in being there, in seeing the evidence with my own eyes. After a while, I saw her leave with Tom, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, heading toward his car as if nothing else mattered. They stood close, whispering, his hand brushing her cheek, and for a moment, I felt that familiar pang of betrayal, sharp and cold. But just as quickly it faded, replaced by something harder. I had more than enough proof. Now I just needed to wait. Jessica's birthday was approaching, and I knew it was time to finalize my plan. I'd built a solid case of her infidelity. Photos, texts, locations, and dates, all carefully documented. But this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. No, if she thought she could sneak around with my best friend, she was about to learn just how serious I was. For the birthday gathering, Jessica had invited her entire family, along with a few close friends. Tom, of course, was on the guest list, and I suspected he was as comfortable with the idea as she was. The irony didn't escape me. They probably thought they were safe, that they could keep up the pretense of friendship, of normalcy, without me ever suspecting a thing. It was almost laughable, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction knowing they had no idea what was coming. But before I made my move, I wanted to give Tom a taste of the consequences he'd set in motion. The anonymous letter detailing his fraudulent activities had already been sent to his company's HR department, and I'd heard whispers from mutual friends that he'd been called in for an unexpected meeting. I knew his boss well enough to know that they'd be reviewing every expense report, every questionable transaction, and Tom would have a hard time explaining his way out of it. To add fuel to the fire, I'd sent another letter to a couple of board members, detailing specific dates and names, showing how he'd used company funds for business dinners that never happened, hotels he billed under bogus names, and expense reports for personal luxuries. I'd even included details about the hotels he and Jessica frequented, a jab he wouldn't easily recover from. The days leading up to the party were oddly peaceful. I was calm, almost serene, as I went through my daily routines. Jessica remained blissfully unaware of the chaos she'd set in motion. I watched her go about her day, humming in the kitchen, texting on her phone with that satisfied little smile. And every time I saw it, I felt the cold satisfaction of knowing she'd get what she deserved soon enough. On the morning of her birthday, Jessica was in high spirits. She greeted me with a bright smile, acting as though everything was perfectly normal, her betrayal hidden behind her practiced charm. It almost made me laugh. She had no idea that the person she was smiling at, laughing with, was the same man who was about to turn her world upside down. That evening, the house filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and lively conversation. Jessica's parents arrived early, bringing a cake and a few gifts, and her siblings soon followed. Everyone seemed genuinely happy, enjoying the evening and celebrating. It was a strange contrast, watching people who cared about her, genuinely celebrating her life while I stood among them, fully aware of the truth. Tom arrived last, a bit later than the others, but Jessica's face lit up when she saw him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. The quick flash of excitement in her eyes, the way she straightened up when he entered. He greeted me with a firm handshake, all smiles and charm, as though we were the best of friends. And to everyone else, that's exactly what we were. The two of them blended into the crowd, mingling, catching up with friends and family as if nothing was out of place. But as the evening progressed, I noticed Jessica stealing glances at him, small, secretive smiles that anyone else would have missed. It was all there, just beneath the surface, a silent reminder of the web they'd spun. And soon everyone else would see it too. When the time came for the birthday toast, I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. The guests gathered around, raising their glasses, and I took my place at the center of the room. I waited a moment, letting the silence settle as everyone looked at me expectantly. To Jessica, I began, raising my glass. A woman who's always been dedicated, caring, and I paused, searching for the right words, full of surprises. Jessica gave me a puzzled look, but I could see Tom shifting uncomfortably in the corner, sensing that something was off. I continued, my tone steady, measured, letting each word sink in. I've had the privilege of being by her side for 15 years, through every up and down, every joy and challenge. I looked directly at her, keeping my expression neutral. And tonight, I want to celebrate not just her, but the incredible moments we've shared. I set down my glass and reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone. In fact, I said, my voice calm and deliberate, I've put together a little something to capture those moments, a slideshow, you could say. With a few taps, I connected my phone to the TV screen in the corner, where I'd prepared a folder of photos and messages, each one carefully selected, organized, and displayed. The screen flickered to life, and at first everyone saw pictures from past years, holidays, birthdays, vacations. Jessica's face softened, a look of nostalgia crossing her face as she watched the memories flash by. But then, the images shifted. The first was a photo from a few weeks prior, a shot of Jessica's car parked outside a hotel. The next was a text message exchange, clearly showing her messages with Tom, their meetup times and dates plainly visible. And then, photos from Dan's Halloween party, the one where they'd slipped into his daughter's room, thinking no one would ever see. The room fell silent, all eyes glued to the screen. Jessica's face turned pale, her mouth opening slightly as she realized what she was seeing. Tom's expression was equally stunned, his confident, smug demeanor replaced with wide-eyed shock. Each image, each message played in slow, relentless succession, showing everything. The secret meetings, the lies, the nights spent together. Jessica turned to me, her face a mask of horror, but I kept my expression calm, unwavering. When the final image faded from the screen, I turned back to the stunned guests, raising my glass one last time. To honesty, loyalty, and the truth, I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. I held Jessica's gaze, watching as the weight of her lies finally crushed the mask she'd worn for so long. As the last image faded from the screen, the silence in the room felt unbearable, a crushing weight that seemed to fill every corner. Jessica stood there, frozen in place, her face an unreadable mask of shock and disbelief. She'd always been poised, quick with words and charm, but tonight that skill seemed to abandon her completely. She glanced around the room, eyes darting from face to face, as if hoping someone might break the tension, offer her a lifeline. But no one moved, no one spoke. Her parents looked as if they'd been struck, struggling to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the woman who'd been leading a double life. Jessica's mother, who had always treated me like her own son, shook her head, her mouth slightly open as she tried to process what she'd just seen. Her father's face was etched with a mixture of disbelief and anger, his lips pressed into a thin line. They, too, were betrayed, blindsided by the daughter who had always seemed so dependable, so devoted. For a long moment, Jessica stood silent, as though she could erase the truth simply by refusing to acknowledge it. But eventually, she looked over at me, her expression pleading, eyes wide with fear. "Michael," she whispered, her voice small, barely audible. "Michael, I can explain." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my composure. "Explain?" I echoed, my voice calm, steady. What exactly do you think you can explain, Jessica? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her usual confidence, her charm, all of it was gone. She'd been unmasked, her lies laid bare, and now she was struggling to find any justification, any excuse for what she'd done. It was her father who spoke next, his voice low but unyielding. Jessica, how could you do this? He asked, his tone laced with hurt and disappointment. To Michael, to all of us? His gaze was steady, and Jessica seemed to shrink under it, her shoulders slumping as the reality of her actions began to sink in. I don't know, she mumbled, barely able to meet his gaze. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. Of course not, Jessica, I said, my voice cold. You thought you could keep it hidden, that I'd never find out. You wanted the best of both worlds, a loving husband at home, and whatever this is. I gestured toward the screen, where the last image of her and Tom lingered, burned into everyone's memory. Jessica's mother wiped a tear from her cheek, looking away as if she couldn't bear to see her daughter like this. Jessica's brother, who had been standing silently to the side, took a step forward, his jaw clenched, fists balled at his sides. He didn't say anything, but his expression spoke volumes. He looked at Tom, who was standing by the door, clearly wishing he could disappear. Tom, the man who'd been like a brother to me, now looked as small and insignificant as the betrayal he'd tried to hide. I think you should leave, I said, directing my words at both of them. My voice was steady, but the finality in it was unmistakable. Both of you. Jessica turned toward me, desperation flashing in her eyes. Michael, please, we could talk about this. We don't have to make this public. I looked at her, barely able to contain the disgust I felt. Public? I repeated, incredulous. You brought this on yourself, Jessica. You're the one who chose to live a lie. You thought you could get away with it. Thought you were too clever to be caught. But now, everyone knows the truth, and you'll have to live with it. Tom took a step toward me, hands raised slightly as though to placate me. Michael, look, I know it's terrible, but it was just a mistake. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I turned my gaze to him, letting the full weight of my contempt show. A mistake? I asked, my voice dripping with disdain. Is that what you call months of lying? Sneaking around behind my back, betraying my trust, our friendship? You're pathetic, Tom. And don't think for a second that this ends here. Tom's face paled, and he looked away, unable to hold my gaze. The people in the room shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, trying to process what they'd witnessed. Friends who'd known us for years, who had been part of our lives, now saw Jessica and Tom in a completely different light. They'd built their relationships with us on trust, on the belief that we were all decent, honorable people. And now, that belief was shattered. When the last guest finally left, Jessica was still there, standing in the empty living room, surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to be her celebration. She looked lost, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She took a shaky breath, then looked up at me, her expression a mixture of desperation and shame. Michael, please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we've been together so long. Don't just throw it all away. I stared at her, feeling none of the love, none of the compassion I once felt for this woman. She was a stranger to me now, a stranger who had shattered my life without a second thought. Jessica, you're the one who threw it all away, I said, my voice cold, detached. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, cutting her off. There's nothing you can say that will change what you did. You lied, Jessica. You lied to me, to your family, to everyone who trusted you. There's no coming back from that. She looked down, defeated, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, she was facing the consequences of her actions, and there was no escape, no excuse. She would finally understand the pain she had caused, the destruction she had brought upon herself. In the days that followed, I focused on ensuring Tom felt the full weight of his betrayal. My anonymous letter to his company had set an investigation into motion, and it didn't take long for the rumors to spread. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been called in for questioning, that his bosses were reviewing every expense report, every questionable transaction. The company was known for its strict policies, and I knew they wouldn't tolerate the kind of fraud he'd been committing. I also made a few quiet calls to people in his industry, letting them know in vague terms that Tom's integrity was questionable. I didn't reveal any specifics, just enough to plant a seed of doubt. And sure enough, word spread. People talked, rumors grew, and soon Tom's name was tainted, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. He reached out to me once, leaving a message on my phone, his voice pleading, desperate. "Michael, please. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but this is my life. You don't have to do this." I deleted the message without responding. Tom had made his choices, just like Jessica, and now he was facing the consequences. I felt no guilt, no sympathy. He was nothing to me now, just another person who'd thought he could betray me without consequence. Jessica tried to reach out as well, sending texts, leaving notes, begging me to give her a chance to explain, to make things right. But I was done. I had already started meeting with a lawyer, going through the steps to separate our lives as quickly and cleanly as possible. I didn't want drawn-out fights or messy confrontations. I just wanted her out of my life. One morning, she finally broke down, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands shaking. "Michael, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know I can't undo what I did, but don't leave me. Don't throw it all away." I looked at her, feeling nothing but a distant sadness, a faint echo of what once was. "Jessica," I said quietly, "you threw everything away the moment you decided to lie to me. There's nothing left to save." She lowered her head, defeated, and I felt a strange sense of closure. She knew, finally, that this was the end. As the divorce proceedings began, I focused on rebuilding. The memories of our life together faded into the background, and I found a new sense of purpose. Friends and family reached out, offering support, and I realized I was stronger than I had ever been. The pain, the betrayal, it had forged a new resolve in me, one that could not be broken. Jessica moved out, and the house became a quiet sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe. Each day, I felt a little freer, a little stronger. And though the journey was difficult, I knew that I was moving toward a future built on honesty, on integrity, a future that was mine to shape. The days after the divorce were quiet. For the first time in years, my life was free from the constant hum of someone else's presence, someone's expectations, and someone's lies. The house felt different, emptier, yes, but in a way that felt freeing rather than lonely. I wasn't surrounded by reminders of Jessica's betrayal. I'd already gone through each room, changing things, rearranging the furniture, letting the space become mine again. Every small change was a step forward, a deliberate act of reclaiming my life. At first, there was a numbness to everything. I went about my daily routine like clockwork, waking up early, making coffee, heading into work. It was a bit surreal, moving through a world where my old life no longer existed, where everything I'd known had been uprooted. But beneath the numbness, I felt something else, an unfamiliar sense of calm. I'd spent so long living in Jessica's shadow, in a life we'd built together, and now, for the first time, I felt the weight of that life lifting, piece by piece. I'd started to reconnect with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years, people Jessica had subtly distanced me from. It was as though she'd wanted me to exist solely in her world, surrounded by her friends, her family, and her routines. But now, I was free to rediscover the people who had known me long before Jessica came into the picture. They welcomed me back with open arms, no questions asked, no judgment. They simply understood, and that quiet acceptance was something I hadn't realized I'd missed. In the quiet moments, when I'd sit alone in the house, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. There were nights when I couldn't escape the memories, the images of Jessica and Tom together, laughing, sharing stolen glances, thinking they'd gotten away with it. I'd wonder how long it had truly been going on, if there were other betrayals I'd never known about. The anger would come in waves, but each time it felt weaker, more distant, as if it was slowly fading from my system. I used to think that betrayal would destroy me, that discovering Jessica's lies would shatter everything I'd built. But what I hadn't expected was the clarity it brought. I could see now, looking back, all the small signs I'd ignored, the vague excuses, the odd silences, the way she'd pull away whenever I tried to get close. I thought I was just being paranoid, that I was reading too much into her behavior. But it was all there, hidden in plain sight. In a strange way, the betrayal had shown me my own strength. I'd confronted the lies, gathered the truth, and taken control of the situation. I hadn't let them manipulate me, hadn't let Jessica or Tom turn me into a fool. Instead, I'd faced them both with a calm, deliberate resolve. And in doing so, I'd reclaimed my own dignity. It was a hard truth, one that had taken time to accept, but in the end, it made me stronger. With each passing day, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. I'd taken a few days off work to clear my head, to make sense of where I was and where I wanted to go. My job had always been steady, predictable, but now I felt a pull towards something new, something challenging. I began considering a shift, maybe a new department, or even a new position altogether. I wanted to push myself, to see what I was truly capable of without the constraints of a life built around someone else's expectations. I started reading more, picking up books I hadn't touched in years, revisiting old hobbies that I'd let fall by the wayside. I even signed up for a woodworking class, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for. The projects gave me a sense of purpose, a tangible reminder that I was still capable of creating something meaningful, something lasting. Each piece I built, every rough edge I sanded down, was a reminder that I could shape my own life in the same way, that I had the power to rebuild. I found myself drawn to the outdoors as well, taking long walks in the evenings, breathing into fresh air, letting the quiet settle around me. Nature had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that life went on, that there was beauty in simplicity, in solitude. Those walks became a ritual, a way to clear my mind, to leave the past behind and step forward into a future that was mine alone. As the months went by, I started to meet new people, reconnecting with old friends and making new connections. I wasn't searching for anything specific, wasn't looking to replace Jessica or fill the void she'd left. I was simply open, willing to let life bring what it would. And in that openness, I found something unexpected, a sense of genuine connection, of honesty that I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, I attended a small gathering at a friend's house, a quiet dinner with people who had known me for years, people who had seen me through the highs and lows of life. Among them was a woman named Sarah, someone I'd known distantly, a friend of a friend. We'd crossed paths before, shared a few conversations, but I'd never really seen her, not until that night. There was something refreshing about Sarah, a quiet strength, a warmth that felt genuine. She wasn't flashy or overly charming. She was simply real. We talked about books, about life, about the paths we'd taken to get where we were. She listened without judgment, without trying to fix me, and I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't expected. We kept in touch after that night, meeting for coffee, going for walks, sharing quiet conversations that felt easy, natural. There was no rush, no pressure, just a steady, growing connection that felt like the beginning of something solid, something honest. In time, I realized that I no longer thought about Jessica and Tom with anger or bitterness. They were part of my past, yes, but they no longer had power over me. I'd moved beyond the pain, the betrayal, and found a new life on the other side. Jessica had tried to reach out once or twice, sending a brief message, a half-hearted apology, but I ignored it. There was nothing left to say, no reason to revisit the pain she'd caused. The friends who had stood by me during the worst of it were still there, their loyalty unshaken, their support unwavering. We'd gone through the fire together, and those bonds felt stronger now, more real. They'd shown me the meaning of true friendship, of loyalty, and I was grateful for their presence in my life. I knew I'd never take that for granted again. As for Tom, his name rarely came up anymore. His life had taken a downturn after our confrontation, his reputation tarnished, his career derailed. I didn't take pleasure in his downfall. I simply accepted it as a consequence of his choices. He'd made his bed, and now he was lying in it. And as far as I was concerned, that chapter of my life was closed. One evening, as I sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a deep sense of peace. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, and the world felt vast, filled with possibilities. I'd come a long way from that night of betrayal, from the anger, the pain, the bitterness. I'd walked through the fire, faced the truth, and emerged on the other side, stronger and more certain of who I was. The life I'd built with Jessica was gone, yes, but in its place was something far more precious. A life built on my own terms, a future shaped by my own choices. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I felt ready for it, ready to embrace whatever came my way with open arms and an open heart. As I sat there, watching the stars begin to appear, I felt a quiet gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the strength I'd found within myself, for the people who had stood by me when everything else had fallen apart. I knew that I was no longer defined by the past, by the mistakes of others. I was free, truly free, to live a life that was mine alone. And in that freedom, I found a kind of joy, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. I was ready, at last, to face the world on my own terms, to build a future that was bright, open, and filled with possibilities. This was my life, my journey, and I was ready to make it something beautiful,